Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
If you watch television commercials at all, you know that the key words to marketing in our capitalist system are new and improved. Candy bars, laundry soap, you name it, put it in a new box, and it's new and improved. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we're going to talk about the new and improved package we're getting from Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Is this restructuring that he's doing for real, or is it merely a new package? Today, our guests are Dwight Hoover from the Department of History at Ball State University, Ruth House from Physics, and John Rouse, our producer and a member of the Political Science faculty. John, is this merely a new package, or is the reform for real in the Soviet Union?
The reform is not for real because that will take years, a very long time. It's one thing for a charismatic leader to raise the issue for change, and that's what Gorbachev has done. It's something else for the bureaucracy to change and to implement those issues. So the call for openness in the Soviet society is a very unusual new thing for Soviets. It never has been done in their history, going back prior to 1917. And so their society has been very authoritarian, and it has not been an open society. They have been very much fearful of the outside. So for the Soviets to be open, both to themselves and to others, is a very unusual thing, and the reform will take years to occur, if it indeed occurs.
Dwight Hoover, is this really a radical step that Mikhail Gorbachev is proposing in his restructuring, or is this just another of the small steps taken in the post-Stalin era?
Well, in the short range, it's a small step. I think in the long range, it has potential consequences of radical change. I think the Russians are a little like the Chinese. Once you start liberalizing, there are some concrete problems that you have. How do you control the pace of liberalization? How do you prevent liberalization from completely changing the society? So if you started, I think, at the analogies like driving a wagon down a hill, you want to keep the brake on so that it won't run away. At the same time, you would like a little bit more speed. So it's a very delicate kind of circumstance. You would like to have a more liberal society. The Russians structurally have a superfluous labor force. About 10% of their people are probably underemployed or working at jobs that have really very little to contribute to their society. So they would like to restructure their society so that they can divert resources into areas that would be of more use to them.
Ruth House, I guess the most attention has been focused since Gorbachev has become secretary on his movements to limit nuclear arms. Certainly, the world attention and a lot of press during the Reykjavik summit. Is his approach in that area radically different from what the Soviet Union had?
Gorbachev has been offering some very attractive bargains. His latest offer on intermediate-range nuclear weapons contains two significant concessions and, unfortunately, one significant non-concession. He's offered to consider limiting intermediate-range nuclear weapons without reaching an agreement on strategic defenses in space, which is, of course, a big concession to us. And he's offered to consider reducing the Soviet intermediate-range weapons in Europe to zero without bargaining at all about the French and British arsenals. And he also has asked that we decouple the issue of intermediate-range nuclear weapons from short-range or battlefield tactical weapons. And this, of course, is unacceptable to the United States. So while it's a very attractive offer, we're going to have to bargain before we can see a treaty come out of it.
Of course, our bargainer is President Reagan, and there's been a lot of comparison between Gorbachev and Reagan. Is that a fair comparison?
Well, I think for one of the first times, the Russians have a younger leader than we do. And that's an interesting comparison. Gorbachev, by Reagan standards, seems very much an activist leader. It's hard to know what signals are coming out of Washington. Reagan relies, as we all know, on a staff. I think the significant change in staff recently has been the resignation of Richard Pearl, who, although he was only an assistant secretary of defense, probably carried the most weight of anybody in the Defense Department because of his close connection with Caspar Weinberger. And now with his hardline position gone, that may signal a change in the direction of greater willingness to negotiate arms control.
I think the important thing to recognize about Reagan is that Reagan, of course, is perceived as a conservative, and a conservative can do the liberal thing. In other words, a liberal Democrat could not deal with the Soviets. A Hubert Humphrey, for example, could not deal with the Soviets because, for one reason or another, perhaps the American people would not trust a Hubert Humphrey. So now is the time to strike a deal on arms control. In the past, the same thing perhaps could be said for Jimmy Carter. Now is the time for the American people, through their leader, President Reagan, who is perceived as a conservative, to make a political deal. So if it's not done in the next 2 years, it might not be done for some time to come.
But in 6 years, Reagan really hasn't done anything on arms control. It's not been in his record to do this. It would be surprising, I think. It would be a political coup, I think, if he could do it, but his record on that has not been particularly good.
And I think one problem is that he perceives strategic defenses as a technical fix to the problem of nuclear arms. And before real progress can be made, the Soviets will insist that some limitation be placed on defensive systems. Also, the Reagan administration has recently broken the SALT II limit, which destroyed that treaty, and the new non-restrictive interpretation of the ABM treaty threatens to destroy the Soviet understanding of that treaty. So at the moment, we're on a roll of breaking treaties rather than making them, which is not, in my opinion, particularly an optimistic sign.
Ruth, if I could ask you a question about the Soviet military establishment, it would seem to me, to make the point that I made, that even though Gorbachev is saying that we should cut back, it would seem that there would be tremendous opposition from the Soviet military bureaucracy to oppose any kind of change, mainly because of self-interest. Would that not be the case?
I think there's some opposition. I hear that he has not yet gotten complete control of the Soviet military bureaucracy and that there is some kind of an internal power struggle. Your sources on that are probably better than mine. But I think that the military, both in this country, the uniformed military, not the Office of the Secretary of Defense, but the uniformed military, are basically pragmatists about this. They're the ones who are going to have to fight the war if we fight a nuclear war. And I don't think any sane military man wants to fight a nuclear war.
President Reagan has been under some criticism by I don't want to call it the far right, but it's a very conservative element of this nation. Is he a little sensitive about perhaps being perceived as giving in to the Soviets, of making concessions in terms of nuclear arms?
Well, I think he probably is. It's difficult to say because when he went to Reykjavik, he really offered to give a lot of things away, and it's difficult to say which is the real Reagan. Is it the spontaneous Reagan who says we'll get rid of all the missiles and we'll give the Russians SDI and so on? Is this the Reagan we're talking about, or is it the same Reagan when he's speaking before a conservative audience? I think he has several positions, and I don't know which position is dominant. That's been one of the criticisms of the Reagan administration, that there's a good deal of infighting there. It depends on who's writing the speech for the particular day, what the particular position will be, and I think the positions are contradictory positions. I don't think that there is a day-to-day consistency. John probably could respond to that better than I.
Essentially, you're into the third Reagan administration. And the first Reagan administration, the chief of staff was James Baker. He was a political person who was part of George Bush's staff in 1980. The second Baker, of course, is the Baker from Tennessee. And both Bakers are very politically conscious and very pragmatic. And the Republicans are going to want a couple of things in 1988. They're going to want a background in terms of arms control and a treaty, and they're also going to want a very good economy. And those are the two things that win politically. And so for that reason, I think that's going to be their focus. And the Republican Party, whatever it's going to be from day to day, is going to be focused upon how can we win in 1988. So I look for a very pragmatic Republican effort in this regard.
I think that with Baker in the White House, that there'll be more of an attempt to placate Congress, and I think Sam Nunn's opposition to the broad interpretation of the treaty will carry a good deal of weight, and I look for a compromise on that.
Back to the first term or tenure of Mikhail Gorbachev. Are we fascinated with this guy because he is somebody different, or just because he's not Khrushchev and he's not Brezhnev?
I think that the thing we can say about Gorbachev is that for since 1917, how many years ago that's been, the focus has been upon the party. You're finding more and more focus upon the state, and the state bureaucracy is having influence in the Soviet Union. What has happened is that since 1917, you had a very charismatic movement. It was something called socialism. Lenin, it was also further implemented by Stalin. And so what has happened in their society is that the charisma of socialism has played out and it's not working. And it's been routinized or implemented or focused upon in bureaucracies, and the bureaucracies are not working and they're not playing out as they should. And so they've gotten to that point, and so the switch then has been from the party, the political party meaning the Communist Party, although it's still influential, the state bureaucracies are now also very influential.
It's difficult to pass unnoticed the fact that recently an NKVD man was reprimanded. That had never happened before, and there's some attempt to even have a couple of candidates for particular positions, right, in smaller communities. And so I think that shows a willingness to move in the direction of greater political participation by the people involved. And it's true, the Soviets for years have had bureaucracies which have cooked figures. You don't know what their production of certain things are. They meet their quota, but we know that their quota isn't all that great. One of the things they're trying to do is cut down on the consumption of vodka. I noticed recently that they said 17% of their recent products was vodka. So how much was it before they got down to 17%? So all of these things, I think they would like to have a more responsive economy, one that responds to consumer needs. They would like to have a little bit more freedom and get away from the straitjacket of state control.
Well, isn't that the why that we're dealing with? That when we're talking about restructuring the culture, the mindset of the Soviet Union, is in fact that the economy just hasn't worked, hasn't taken off. In fact, things are not very good for the consumer in the Soviet Union, and that to become this, as one writer said, the good neighbor in the family of nations of this world, that Mikhail Gorbachev has had to soften the image of the Soviet Union.
Well, don't you think that we're also seeing a society that's maturing, that with Gorbachev and the younger, in quotes, generation of Soviet leaders, that for the first time we're seeing men who don't remember the revolution, and we're not old enough to fight in World War II, and so that we're seeing a new generation.
I think the thing we have to emphasize, since this is an Indiana program, you have to ask, why would Hoosiers be interested in this kind of discussion? Hoosiers, first of all, are very trade-oriented. Time and time again, we've had Soviet representatives come to this campus and they talk about peace and reduction of weapons. It seems to me the way to peace, historically, Dwight certainly knows more about this than I do, would be through trade. And when there has been World War, there's been a tremendous breakdown when it comes to trade and economics. And so the more opportunity that we have for a Soviet Union that is focused upon openness and trade and exchange of economies, this is a much better chance to promote peace. And so Hoosiers then would be very much interested in the focus upon economics and trade.
Because of their climate, they have difficulty raising enough food grains, and their attempt to go to corn raising wasn't very successful. So there's a good market there, as it's been a continuing market. Of course, they're having to compete with other countries. There's another problem involved there, too. The Soviets want to become more advanced technologically, and it seems to me, and that a technologically based society has to be in some ways a freer society. If everybody has a PC, it's very difficult to keep information from circulating. And the Soviets, I think, are very aware of their technological lag in this particular area. How are they going to compete with us, let alone the Japanese, without some kind of responsive industrial base?
Ruth, if I could ask you a question, what is the difference between strategic nuclear weapons or strategic weapons and tactical weapons? I mean, that is a kind of a confusing thing to me.
It's
Well-
500 miles.
Yes, essentially. Dwight's correct. The defense is very logical from our point of view. From our point of view, a strategic weapon is anything that can hit our mainland. And since they're based overseas, that gives them a range of about 6,000 miles minimum. From the Soviet point of view, it's an artificial distinction because obviously a weapon based in Western Europe is much closer to Soviet territory than are our weapons. That's why the fuss about the Pershing II. The Pershing II can hit Soviet targets, Moscow specifically, from bases in Western Europe. And that's why the Soviets put it in a different category from shorter range weapons that can reach the Warsaw Pact countries, but not Soviet territory itself.
If I can follow up for a question perhaps for both of you, the Europeans were very much upset by the Iceland summit. And it seems to me that for years they've been blaming all the problems upon the Americans. The Americans put these awful nuclear weapons into West Germany 3 or 4 years ago, and it's the Americans' fault. And then the Soviets talk to the Americans and more or less try to convince them, yes, you should take these weapons out. And who opposes this but the West Europeans? Why do you think this is the case in terms of the politics of Western Europe?
The Economist's lead article this week is one on American troop reduction in Europe, and I think the big problem is an economic one. We've been subsidizing the military protection of Western Europe, and if nuclear weapons are pulled out, we'll have to have much more conventional weaponry. We'll have to have more troops, and we aren't going, given our economic situation, want to support that, and that means an increase in the defense budget in a lot of other places. Interesting note, the English have one general for every 495 soldiers. Our proportion is 1 to every 2,700, and this article pointed out the English are really going to have to modernize and get rid of some of the old guys sitting around, and that's the same thing will be true everywhere else. It means maybe they'll have to spend as much on defense as we're spending on defense, and given their consumer-oriented societies, I don't think they want to do that.
The other fear they have, I think, is that the United States, if we do not feel that the United States mainland will be attacked in the event of a war in Europe, that we will dare to fight a nuclear war on European territory on the assumption that we can escape without an attack on our territory.
Perhaps you know more about this, Ruth, but I was reading in Foreign Affairs where the percent of the cost for nuclear weapons is actually quite low in comparison, something like 15%, 20%. So if we cut back on nuclear weapons in terms of the cost and put more money into conventional forces, this will mean more money from the taxpayers to support a larger standing army. Would that not be the case?
I think so,
Yeah.
yes.
And so for that reason there would be opposition to this kind of change.
The argument in favor of nuclear weapons has always been more bang for the buck.
Is there sufficient pressure on the American and Soviet economies, sufficient pressure from world opinion, that we're going to see some significant progress on arms control during the last quarter of President Reagan's administration?
There is a lot of pressure, yes. I think we're having difficulty right now. Caspar Weinberger has just come back from Spain. The Spanish agreed to keep NATO bases, and American bases in Spain agreed to stay in NATO on the arrangement that we would cut back on what we've put there. Now we don't want to cut back, and the Spanish are protesting pretty vehemently. And I think eventually we will have to reduce our military presence in Spain. And I think this is happening not just in Spain, but throughout Western Europe. And part of the reason they want us to cut back is because of the large SAC base we have in Torreon, which is atomically capable. And they're saying they don't want any nuclear weapons based in Spain. So I think that if we were to lose bases like that, we very well might want to reduce our nuclear weaponry through some kind of treaty arrangement.
Are you optimistic, Ruth?
I think maybe we'll see progress on INF. I don't think we'll see the kind of major agreement that was outlined at Reykjavik. We're going to cut all missiles, strategic missiles, by 50%. I think we may well see progress on the SS-20s and the Pershing IIs and the Glickums, ground-launched cruise missiles in Europe.
Is Gorbachev looking toward 88, hoping he gets a better negotiating partner?
I think he's got Reagan where he wants him with the pressure of 88 on him.
Yeah, that's my feeling, that I think the Russians have come to a point where they think this is their time to get something. I don't think they want to wait. I think they want to work now.
I think we have to emphasize the fact that the Soviets are a very conservative people. And Gorbachev is the product of a very conservative institutional process. And he views Reagan, although he may disagree with Reagan on a lot of things, he views Reagan as a kind of a stable personality in terms of politics, that he does have a great deal of support with the American people. That is certainly not the case for anybody who might come after him. So it'd take years to get adjusted to someone else.
It's interesting, if you want to draw a parallel, I'm not sure how far this parallel can be drawn, that Nixon was supported by the Chinese when he was in difficulty here. They wanted to keep him on, and they were unable to understand quite what was happening to Nixon. I think the same parallel might be drawn with the Russians and Reagan.
And of course, the Russians are the third major socialist communist power to come around to more entrepreneurial focuses. The Chinese have come around, and the Hungarians have come around. So the Soviets really are not the first ones to come around to opening their system up.
Of course, the Hungarians always were kind of suspect Marxist.
But I think that the Soviets tend to understand American society better than we understand Soviet society. They learn English in schools. They work on our culture. I think they have a very good idea of what Reagan is facing politically. I think we could do with a little bit better understanding of the Soviet culture in this country, so that we would be shrewder at the negotiating table because we had experts available to talk about it.
Speaking of the negotiating table, I think it's a kind of an irony to note that the chief negotiator, Max Kappelman, is a Democrat.
Yes.
And he's more or less what I would call a Henry Jackson Democrat. And in fact, another little piece of trivia, he was the first moderator for a program called Washington Week in Review, which is on public television, of which this program is patterned. And so, Larry, he's also a journalist in a way.
Outstanding. We've painted something of a picture here today of Gorbachev and the Soviets as this new and playful, cuddly, clawless bear. A couple of weeks ago, we had 6th District Congressman Dan Burton on his program, a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, a conservative, a Reagan conservative, more conservative than Reagan perhaps, who was here to tell us that, folks, let's not trust this Gorbachev fellow. The Soviets are still exporting their communism. They are still encouraging terrorism around the world. They are backing the communists in the Middle East and Latin America. Who do we believe?
I don't think we've painted a picture of a cuddly bear. I think we've painted a picture of a well-educated lawyer who's a very tough negotiator, who has a lot to gain just now by concluding an arms control agreement on his terms with Reagan, and who has maneuvered extremely shrewdly to put President Reagan in a box up against American elections. And I think that we're dealing with a very tough man. I would hardly call that a portrait of a cuddly bear.
And I don't really believe that that these particular stereotypes reflect the complexity of the situation. I'd agree with Ruth here, and I might remind you that Burton has political ambitions, and it may serve his purpose to look in a certain way.
Well, he said, let's not trust Gorbachev, let's not trust the Soviets, that in fact we're playing into their hands if we negotiate with them, if in fact we make concessions.
Well, I think it's possible we could do that, but we must also remember that negotiations are to our advantage as well, and that it's not a zero-sum game. We can both benefit from negotiations, and I think that's the point that should be kept in mind.
Well, the caution has been, let's not continue, although it seems to be Congressman Burton's position, that we're still looking at the evil empire here, that perhaps that's a view that we can't afford to take?
I think we can trust the Soviets to look after the Soviets' best interest. And I think that any arms control treaty that's going to work and be stable has to have mutual advantages for both countries. That's why the SALT process has lasted as long as it has.
My grandfather's a horse trader, and he always went by the philosophy that he didn't want too good a deal. He wanted the other person to come out with a little something, because if he got too good a deal, then the next time around there was going to be a problem. So his argument was he had to give and take a little bit.
I think the thing we have to look at and pay close attention, of course, is the process of arms negotiation. And Ruth, for example, if the Soviet systems are not open to inspection and that kind of thing, it's going to fall through. So it is not the case that their system is very different from our system. And you have to look at it from a systemic point of view. The issue is, can we trust the process of openness? And as one Republican administration several years used to say, watch what we do, not what we say. And so I think on this important issue, whether it's the Americans or the Soviets, we have to watch what people do, not what they say.
Yeah, the old political slogan on you are watching a politician, don't watch his mouth, watch his feet.
We're out of time here today. Thanks to our guest, Ruth House.
Can't top that one.
Dwight, thank you for ending with a nice quote. Dwight Hoover from History, and John Rouse. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Bill Mosier and Mike Seaborg. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.